In a frozen warehouse in North Bergen, New Jersey, the police found something that would scare them very badly. The body had been kept, frozen in ice for more than 2 years. But the killer had made one big mistake that would lead to his capture. He did not know that this moment would reveal the story of the scariest hired killer America had ever known. This was a man who said he had killed more than 200 people. He was a husband and a father who lived 2 different lives, so well that even his own family did not know. Tonight, we will tell the whole story of Richard Leonard Kuklinski. Before we get into this amazing true story, I want to know where in the world you are watching from tonight. Put your location and the time in the comments below. Are you getting ready for bed like me? Or are you on the other side of the world just waking up? If you are new here, welcome to our group of people who love true crime stories. We look very closely at the most interesting criminal minds in history, with long stories that we have studied a lot. These are perfect for when you are traveling, working, or getting ready for sleep. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. We put out these deep dive stories every day, and you will not want to miss what is coming next. And if this story grabs your attention as much as I think it will, please give it a like and share it with someone who likes real, true crime stories. The story of Richard Leonard Kuklinski starts in the toughest parts of America in the 1930s. He was born on April 11th, 1935, in Jersey City, New Jersey. Richard came into a world that seemed made to create monsters. The tall apartment buildings of Jersey City looked like gray stone graves, holding families hurt by the Great Depression's endless hold. The Kuklinski home was a place full of anger that was ready to burst. Stanley Kuklinski, Richard's father, worked on the railroad, and he was as quick with his fists as he was with drinking. He drank too much alcohol and was very mean, and Stanley saw his family not as loved ones to keep safe, but as people to take his anger out on. Every day brought new scary things to the small apartment, where young Richard tried to hide in the shadows. The beatings were planned out to cause the most pain without leaving marks that would get attention from neighbors or the police. Stanley would use his leather belt, wooden spoons, and sometimes just his huge fists to hit his children until they gave up. Richard would later say that he passed out from how bad these beatings were. It was a child's mind protecting itself from pain that was too much to handle. But it was Richard's mother, Anna Kuklinski, who maybe hurt his mind and feelings the most. She was a very religious Catholic woman who used religion as a way to be mean. Anna would switch between violent punishments and not caring at all. She beat her children with broom handles, kitchen tools, and anything else she could grab, all while teaching them about sin and hell. In her twisted way of thinking, she was saving their souls by making them suffer. The worst moment of Richard's childhood happened when he was just 5 years old. His older brother, Florian, had somehow made their father especially angry that night. What began as a normal beating turned into something much more evil. Stanley's drunken anger had no limits as he hit Florian's head over and over against the floor, the wall, anything hard he could reach. Richard watched, frozen in fear, as his brother's head cracked like an eggshell. The sickening sound would follow him for the rest of his life. Florian died that night, and any good part of Richard that was left might have died with him. The official story was that Florian had fallen down the stairs. This was a handy lie, The police at the time were happy to believe when it came to poor families from other countries. Stanley left the family soon after, leaving Anna to raise her other children by herself. But the harm was already done. Richard had learned that being violent was not only okay, but also what was expected. More importantly, he had learned that the strong live by hurting the weak, and that a person's life had no special worth. As Richard started his years in grade school, the signs of his broken mind became impossible to miss. While other children played with toys, Richard found fun in torture. He would catch stray cats and dogs from the neighborhood, taking them to hidden places where he could act on his growing interest in death. At age 10, Richard's ways of doing things became smarter and meaner. He would make cats fight each other, pretending to bet money on who would win. When the animals would not fight hard enough, he would pour gasoline on them and set them on fire, watching with interest as they screamed and twisted in pain. The smell of burning fur and skin became exciting to him, a hint of the horrible things to come. His teachers noticed that Richard was different, but in the crowded schools of Jersey City during the Depression, a quiet, shy child was often ignored in favor of students who caused more trouble. Richard learned how to fit in with the background and to become unseen when he needed to. This skill would be very useful to him later in his job as a killer. By age 13, Richard's violence had grown from animals to people. There was a neighborhood bully named Charlie Lane who had made the terrible mistake of picking on Richard one too many times. Unlike the other children who were scared of Charlie's tough act, Richard saw a chance to test them. He had ideas about violence that had been taught to him since he was born. The fight happened on a very cold winter day near the Hudson River. Charlie had trapped Richard in an alley, asking for money and threatening to beat him up again. But this time, Richard was ready. He had hidden a thick wooden stick inside his jacket, a weapon he had carefully chosen and gotten ready for a moment just like this. What happened next was not a fight, but a killing. Richard attacked with the cold, perfect skill of a killer who had done it before, even though he was only 13 years old. The first hit to Charlie's head made him fall to his knees. The second broke his skull. Richard kept hitting the boy, who was passed out, until his face could not be recognized, until bits of his brain fell onto the frozen ground. The planned-out way he killed him was maybe the scariest part. Richard felt no anger, no release of feelings, only a cold feeling of success and having gotten rid of a problem. He dragged Charlie's body to the edge of the river, where the winter ice was thin enough to break. The body vanished under the black water with almost no splash. Charlie Lane was reported missing. Richard showed no signs of feeling bad or nervous. He answered the police's questions with the same flat, emotionless way he showed toward everything else. The police investigation went nowhere, and soon, Charlie Lane became just another missing person in a city where people disappeared all the time. But Richard had learned something about himself that night by the river. He enjoyed killing. More than that, he was naturally good at it. The careful planning, the killing, and getting rid of the proof all came to him as easily as breathing. He had found his purpose in life. By age 16, Richard's body changed as much as his mind did. He grew to a scary 6 feet 5 inches tall and got very muscular, which made him look more like a grown man than a teenager. His size, along with his dead-looking eyes and anger that could show up at any time, made him a terrifying person in the neighborhood. The event that really showed Richard had become someone to be feared happened when he was met by 6 older teenage boys who thought they could scare him. Because there were more of them, they had picked the wrong person to bother. Richard carefully beat all 6 of them until they were passed out, using only a metal bar from a neighbor's clothesline. He worked with the same calm and quick way he had shown with Charlie Lane. News of the beating spread quickly through the neighborhood. Parents told their children to stay away from the tall, quiet Kuklinski boy. Shop owners watched him carefully when he came into their stores. The local police started to notice the violence that seemed to follow Richard wherever he went. But maybe the most scary thing of all was Richard's total lack of feeling bad or having any emotional reaction to the violence he caused. When his mother asked him about the beating, he just shrugged and said the boys had asked for it. There was no anger in his voice, no happiness, just a cold statement of fact from someone who saw violence as a tool to be used when needed. Anna Kuklinski, even with her own violent ways, started to be afraid of her son. She would later tell neighbors that there was something not right about Richard, something broken that could never be fixed. She was more right than she knew. The mix of things passed down from his parents, terrible childhood pain, and abuse that happened over and over, had turned him into a very dangerous person who didn't care about others. As Richard got close to his 18th birthday, the habits that would shape his adult life were already set. He was a loner who trusted no one and felt no emotional connection to other people. He saw the world as a place of hunters and hunted, and he was never going to be hunted again. The change was complete. The scared little boy who had watched his brother die had been replaced by something else completely. He was a killing machine in a human body, waiting for the right chance to be let loose on the world. Richard's first crimes were crimes he did when he got a chance, not ones he planned for a long time. At 18, still full of anger and testing how much power he had, he met a man who made the mistake of making fun of how he looked. The man was drunk, feeling safe because his friends were with him, and he had no idea he was about to die because of a careless comment. Richard followed the man to his car, waiting quietly in the dark as the group said their goodbyes. When the man was alone, trying to find his keys in the dark, Richard attacked. But this killing would be different from the ones he had done before. This one would send a message. Richard forced the man into his own car with a knife, then drove to a hidden spot outside the city. What happened next showed how truly mean Richard could be. He did not just kill the man. He tortured him first, using methods that seemed to come from a dark part of him, rather than something he had learned. When the man was barely awake from pain and losing blood, Richard dragged him from the car and poured gasoline on him. The man's screams as he burned alive could be heard for miles in the quiet night air. Richard watched the whole thing with the same separate interest he had shown while torturing animals as a child. The burned body was found 3 days later, but the killing was never solved. Richard had already learned how important it was to leave no one to tell the story, and no proof. The burned car was found miles away, wiped clean of fingerprints. The only clue was how extreme the killing itself was, which pointed to a killer with both amazing cruelty and careful planning skills. This murder was Richard's change from a killer who acted on feelings to a smart hunter. He realized that with good planning and action, he could kill without almost any chance of getting caught. This new knowledge was exciting. He had found not just his purpose, but his fate. As the 1950s began, Richard Kuklinski had changed from a hurt child into a complete monster. Standing 6 feet 5 inches tall and weighing over 270 pounds of pure muscle, he was a terrifying person to look at. But it was the way his mind worked that made him truly dangerous. The total lack of caring for others, the planned way of being violent, and the growing idea that he could make money from death. The stage was set for one of the biggest killing careers in American crime history. The Iceman was about to be born. The change from random violence to killing for money did not happen overnight for Richard Kuklinski. Through his early 20s, he worked in the shady parts of the crime world, doing small tricks, selling illegal pornography, and taking whatever work he could get in the dark underworld of 1950s New Jersey. It was during this time that Richard first met members of organized crime families who would see his special skills and help make him into the perfect killing machine. The Mafia had always needed men willing to do the dirty work, the beatings, the scaring, and the occasional murder that kept their businesses running well. But finding someone with both the physical strength and the right way of thinking to be great at such work was rare. Richard's name as a tough guy grew slowly at first. Word spread through the crime world that there was a giant of a man in Jersey City who could handle any problem, no matter how violent or hard. He never asked questions, never showed feelings, and never left any problems behind. These things made him very useful to criminals who needed someone they could totally count on in their work. His first jobs were pretty simple. Collect money from people who owed it, scare witnesses who might talk against crime family members, and rough up rivals who were moving into their areas. Richard did each job with the same planned and quick way he had shown in his teenage murders. For him, violence was just another tool to be used with care and skill. But it was his growing smarts in the art of killing that truly made Richard different from other crime enforcers. While most tough guys used force and fear, Richard began to study death the way a student might study books. He tried out different methods, different weapons, and different ways to handle each problem. His first job to kill someone for money came through a person he knew in the Gambino crime family. A businessman in Newark had been stealing money from a loan shark business, and the usual ways of scaring him had not worked to fix the problem. The family needed someone who could make the man disappear for good and quietly. Richard took the job, with the same lack of feelings he showed toward everything else. The target was a middle-aged man with a wife and 2 children, exactly the kind of normal person who would never think that death was following him. Richard spent weeks studying the man's daily life, learning his habits, and finding the perfect moment to attack. The murder itself was almost boring. Richard walked up to his target in a parking garage, starting a normal conversation about the weather while getting into position for the killing blow. A single stab of a knife between the ribs, pointing up toward the heart, made the man fall instantly. Richard dragged the body to a car he had waiting, drove to a spot he had checked out weeks before, and got rid of the proof so well that the man was never found. The payment for this first job was large, more money than Richard had ever seen from his different crime jobs. But more important than the money was the feeling that he had found his true job. He was a natural-born killer, and there would always be people who would pay for his work. News of Richard's successful job spread quickly through organized crime groups. The Gambino family especially noticed this new asset. Roy Demio, a very mean member of the family, began using Richard for more and more important jobs. Demio ran a team that specialized in murder and getting rid of bodies, and he saw in Richard a person who was just like him, someone who could kill without stopping or feeling bad. With Damiao's help, Richard's methods became smarter and smarter. He learned about different types of poisons, different guns, and how to use them, and the art of making murders look like accidents or natural deaths. Most importantly, he learned about the business part of killing for money, how to set prices for his work, how to protect himself from the law, and how to keep a good name that would bring him a steady flow of high-paying jobs. The relationship with Demio also taught Richard about the idea of the perfect murder, killings so well planned and carried out that they would never be solved by the police. This became Richard's obsession. He was proud not just of finishing jobs, but of doing them in ways that left police completely confused. It was around this time that Richard began trying out his special method, freezing bodies to confuse the time of death. The idea came to him almost by accident when a job went wrong and he needed to store a body for several weeks before getting rid of it. He noticed that the frozen body showed no signs of rotting, which would make it impossible for science experts to figure out when the person had actually died. Richard tested this method on several more jobs, making his ways better each time. He learned about different freezing methods, how long bodies needed to be frozen to get the result he wanted, and the best ways to move and get rid of frozen bodies. The method was so good that it earned him his famous nickname, the Iceman. The freezing method gave Richard a huge advantage over other hired killers. He could murder someone, keep the body frozen for weeks or even months, then get rid of it in a way that would confuse any police investigation. Witnesses who said they had seen the person alive days or weeks after the actual murder would mess up the timeline and make it nearly impossible for police to figure out what had really happened. As the 1960s went on, Richard's name as the most dependable hired killer on the East Coast grew stronger. He was charging top prices for his work and had more jobs than he could handle. Crime families from New York, Philadelphia, and other big cities were calling him for their most secret jobs. But being successful brought new problems. The higher Richard climbed in the crime world, the more dangerous his world became. He was now working directly with some of the most powerful and paranoid criminals in America, men who would kill him without a second thought if they ever thought he was not loyal or good at his job. Richard got used to this world by being even more careful and planned in his way of killing. He created detailed safety plans, used many fake names, and kept his work so secret that professional secret agents would have been impressed. He trusted no one completely and always had backup plans for every situation. His choice of weapons also became smarter. While many killers used guns almost all the time, Richard became good with almost every type of weapon you can imagine. Knives, crossbows, poison, explosives. He mastered them all, picking the right tool for each specific job. Crossbows became a special favorite because they were silent, very accurate at a short distance, and left unique wounds that confused police who did not know about such strange weapons. Richard would change store-bought crossbows to make them more powerful and accurate, creating special weapons that were as deadly as any gun, but much harder to trace. Poison was the ultimate example of Richard's planned way of murdering. He studied poisons with the focus of a top student, learning about different chemicals, their effects on the human body, how to find them, and the best ways to give them. Cyanide became his poison of choice because it worked quickly and was hard to find in normal autopsies. Richard developed many ways to deliver his poisons. He could put them in drinks, inject them directly into people, create sprays that could be used in small spaces, or even put contact poisons on things that people would touch. The variety of his methods made it nearly impossible for police to connect multiple poison deaths to one killer. His success with poison led to some of his boldest jobs. He could walk into a restaurant, sit near his target, and kill them without anyone there knowing that a murder had happened. The person would simply seem to have a heart attack or stroke, and Richard would be long gone before anyone thought to call for a doctor. The mix of Richard's physical scariness, smart skills, and complete lack of a conscience made him the perfect weapon for organized crime families. He could handle any type of job, from simple scaring to difficult murder plans involving many targets and detailed cover-up plans. By the late 1960s, Richard Kuklinski had changed himself from a mean street thug into one of the most feared and respected hired killers in America. He was paid amounts that would be equal to hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's money, and his skills were wanted from coast to coast. But maybe most amazingly, Richard had managed to keep this life of crime while building what looked like a completely normal suburban life. To his neighbors, his wife, and even his own children, he was just a successful businessman who traveled a lot for work. The ability to keep his two lives separate would have been impossible for most people, but for someone with Richard's way of thinking, it was just another professional skill to master. The stage was now set for the busiest time of Richard's killing career. The methods had been perfected, the name was established, and the demand for his work was higher than ever. The Iceman was about to enter his best years. To understand Richard Kuklinski's history as one of America's most feared hired killers, one must look at the careful and exact way he handled his job. By the 1970s, Richard had turned murder from a simple act of violence into a smart science, creating methods and rules that would affect how criminals worked for many years. The base of Richard's success was his understanding that each murder was a unique problem that needed a special solution. Unlike killers who acted on feelings and used whatever weapon was nearby, Richard treated each job as a hard problem needing careful thought and planning. His first thought was always what the client specifically wanted. Some jobs called for murders. That would send a message, mean public killings made to scare others. Other jobs needed total secrecy, with the person simply disappearing without a clue. Still others needed to look like accidents or natural causes, protecting the client from any thought of being involved. Once Richard understood the rules of a job, he would begin his information gathering part. This could take weeks or even months, depending on how hard the target was. He studied his victims' daily lives with the patience of a professional spy, mapping their daily moves, finding their weak spots, and looking for the perfect moment to attack. Richard's information gathering methods were amazingly smart for someone with no real training. He would do what spies call pattern analysis, watching his targets for long periods to find predictable habits that he could use. He looked for times when targets would be alone, places where he could get to them without witnesses, and situations where their disappearance would not be noticed right away. He also did a lot of background research on his targets, learning about their personal relationships, business deals, and possible enemies. This information helped him plan murders that would point the blame toward other people. If a person had known enemies or was involved in difficult business deals, Richard could set up the murder to make these other people look guilty. The process of choosing a weapon showed Richard's smart skills and understanding of people. He kept a large collection of weapons that included normal guns, strange weapons like crossbows and old daggers, and an impressive collection of poisons and chemicals. But the choice of weapon was never random. It was always matched to the specific needs of each job. For people who needed to disappear completely, Richard liked methods that would destroy or hide physical proof. Acid baths could dissolve bodies completely, while certain poisons would break down into things that could not be found within hours of death. These methods made sure that even if police thought it was murder, they would have no physical proof to support their ideas. When clients wanted to send a message through a certain killing, Richard would choose weapons and methods that created the desired mental effect. A crossbow arrow through the heart sent a different message than a person found with their throat cut. Richard understood the special messages that violence can send and used it to give specific meanings to the people he wanted to reach. His skill with poison needs special attention because it was the very best of his smart skills. Richard had basically taught himself advanced toxicology, studying the effects of different chemicals with the focus of a medical researcher. He understood not just what different poisons would do to the human body, but how they would work with different things like the person's age, weight, medical problems, and recent food they ate. Cyanide became his special poison because of how well it worked and how hard it was to find in standard autopsies. Richard developed many ways to deliver cyanide, each suited to different situations. He could mix it into drinks, inject it directly into people, create aerosol sprays for small spaces, or even put it on things that people would touch with their bare skin. The liquid cyanide delivery system was maybe his most clever new idea. Richard would approach targets in restaurants or bars, starting normal conversations while quietly adding drops of liquid cyanide to their drinks. The poison worked so quickly that people would fall down within minutes, often looking like they were having heart attacks or strokes. By the time medical help arrived, Richard would be long gone, and the cause of death would likely be called natural causes. His aerosol delivery system allowed him to poison many targets at the same time or to kill people in situations where he could not touch them directly. Richard would change commercial spray bottles to create fine mists of diluted cyanide that could be sprayed in cars, small rooms, or other tight spaces. People would breathe in the poison without knowing what was happening, dying within minutes while Richard stayed safely outside the poisoned area. The contact poison use was the ultimate example of Richard's planned approach. He would put strong cyanide solutions on door handles, telephone receivers, steering wheels, or other objects that people would touch during their daily lives. The poison would soak through the skin, killing people hours after Richard had left the scene. This method made it almost impossible to connect the killer to his victim, since there was no proof they had ever been in the same place. But it was the body freezing method that truly earned Richard his famous status. The idea was beautifully simple. By freezing bodies right after death and keeping them frozen for long periods, Richard could confuse forensic investigators about the actual time of death. This confusion would destroy alibis, send investigations in the wrong direction, and make it nearly impossible to set up correct timelines for the murders. Richard's use of this method, however, was not simple at all. He had to solve complex problems: where to store bodies during the freezing process, how to move frozen bodies without being seen, and how to get rid of them in ways that would cause the most confusion for investigators. His solution was, as usual, very complete. Richard rented storage units under fake names, putting industrial freezers in them that could keep the very low temperatures needed for long-term body storage. He changed delivery trucks to move frozen bodies, creating hidden spots that could be reached without showing what was inside to people just looking. The disposal process required careful timing and choosing the right spot. Richard would dump bodies in areas where they would thaw slowly, giving the most time for rotting to hide forensic proof, while still leaving enough of the body for investigators to see that it had been frozen. He often chose spots where bodies would be found quickly, making sure that the apparent time of death would be completely different from what witnesses said about when the people were last seen alive. The mental effect of the freezing method on police was huge. Investigators would talk to witnesses who claimed to have seen victims alive days or weeks after the bodies suggested they had died. These conflicting stories would break up investigations, leading police to question how reliable witnesses were and creating a reasonable doubt that defense lawyers could use in any future trial. Richard's business dealings were as smart as his killing methods. He kept multiple fake names, used different ways of communicating to protect his identity, and had developed price lists that showed the difficulty and risk level of different types of jobs. High-profile targets cost a lot of money, not just because of their importance, but because killing them required more detailed planning and action. Murders that needed to look like accidents cost more than simple killings. Jobs that required getting rid of the body were priced higher than those where clients handled that part themselves. Richard also understood the importance of keeping professional relationships with his criminal clients. He was absolutely reliable. Once he took a job, the target would die according to the agreed upon details and timeline. He never shared client secrets or used information he got during jobs for his own gain. This name for being professional ensured a steady flow of high-paying jobs. His ways of staying safe and secret would have impressed professional intelligence services. Richard used payphones for all business talks, never having criminal discussions from his home or any place that could be traced to his real identity. He kept safe houses stocked with weapons, equipment, and supplies needed for different types of jobs. Financial security was handled through a complex network of accounts and investments that kept his crime money separate from his legal money. Richard understood that unexplained wealth was often what got successful criminals caught by the police. So he was careful to live a life that was comfortable but not too flashy or showy. The mix of smart skills, operational smarts, and psychological understanding made Richard Kuklinski the most effective hired killer of his time. His methods were studied and copied by other criminals, while police agencies struggled to find ways to counter his techniques. But maybe most amazingly, Richard was able to keep this extraordinary life of crime while living what looked like a completely normal suburban life. The ability to keep these two worlds separate was perhaps his most impressive achievement, and, in the end, his biggest weakness. The planned approach that made Richard so good as a killer also created patterns that could eventually be found by determined enough investigators. Every method, no matter how smart, left some trace of proof. Every contact with the crime world created potential witnesses. Every successful job added to a name that would eventually get the attention of the police. By the early 1980s, Richard Kuklinski had perfected the art of murder to a level that few criminals had ever reached. But perfection in the criminal world is often its own trap. The same attention to detail and planned approach that had made Richard so successful would in the end give investigators the tools they needed to bring him down. Iceman's methods had made him a legend in the crime world. Soon, it would make him one of the police's most wanted criminals. Perhaps the scariest part of Richard Kuklinski's story is not the planned cruelty of his crimes, but the amazing success with which he kept a completely separate life as a loving family man, while he was earning a name as one of America's most feared hired killers. Richard was at the same time building what seemed to be a perfect suburban life, with a loving wife, 3 children, and the respect of his neighbors. The two different sides were so separate that it was hard to understand psychologically. By day, Richard was a terrifying person who could torture a victim to death without showing the slightest feeling. By evening, he was a patient father, helping his children with homework, and a thoughtful husband who never forgot anniversaries or birthdays. The mental separation required to keep such very different personalities would have been impossible for most people. But for someone with Richard's unique way of thinking, it was just another professional skill. Richard met Barbara Pedrisci in the early 1960s, when she was working as a secretary in New York City. Barbara was everything that Richard's violent world was not. Gentle, trusting, hopeful about the future, and completely unaware of the crime world that filled his life. She represented the normal life that some part of Richard desperately wanted, even as he continued to build his name as the most reliable killer on the East Coast. Their dating was surprisingly normal. Richard showed a charm and thoughtfulness that seemed completely different from his professional personality. He brought Barbara flowers, took her to nice restaurants, and spoke seriously about his dreams for the future. There was no hint of the monster that was hidden under the surface. Just a successful businessman who traveled a lot and seemed dedicated to making her happy. Barbara later remembered that she was attracted to Richard's confidence and seeming success. He drove expensive cars, dressed well, and always seemed to have lots of money. When she asked about his business, Richard explained that he worked in money exchange and a business that sends things to and from other countries, fields that were complex enough that Barbara did not ask for details. She would not understand anyway. The wedding took place in 1963, and Barbara went into marriage with no idea that she was connecting her life to one of the most dangerous criminals in America. Richard had built his legal identity so carefully that even a deep investigation would have found nothing suspicious. He paid taxes on the money he said he made from different legal businesses, kept proper papers for all his activities, and had no criminal record that could be traced to his real name. The early years of marriage were, by all accounts, truly happy. Richard seemed to enjoy the role of a loving husband, and Barbara was happy with the attention of a man who seemed to adore her. Richard's criminal activities were carefully planned around his home life. He never brought work stress home. never showed the cold, mean way that was part of his professional personality, and never gave Barbara any reason to think that her husband was anything other than a successful businessman. When their first child, Merrick, was born in 1964, Richard's change into a family man seemed complete. He was there for the birth, was involved in daily childcare, and showed a gentleness that would have shocked the criminals who knew him only as the Iceman. Neighbors later remembered seeing Richard pushing a baby carriage through their suburban neighborhood, looking like any other proud new father. The family grew with the birth of daughter Kristen in 1968 and son David in 1970. With each child, Richard seemed to become more dedicated to his role as a family leader. He coached Little League teams, went to school plays, and was involved in different community activities to people watching from the outside. The Kuklinski family seemed to be living the American dream. Richard's success at keeping things separate was clear in every part of his home life. When he returned from jobs, there was no sign of the violence he had just done. He could torture a victim to death on a Tuesday afternoon, then go to his daughter's piano recital that evening, showing real pride and love. The mental tricks that allowed this kind of switching between personalities are still largely not explained by criminal psychology experts. His children knew their father as a loving, if sometimes strict, family leader who provided well for his family and was always there when they needed him. Richard went to parent-teacher conferences, helped with homework, and took the family on fancy vacations to Disney World and other places. The children never saw him lose his temper in the explosive, violent way that marked his professional meetings. Barbara knew her husband as a successful businessman who traveled a lot but always made family his first priority. Richard would call home every day when he was away on business trips that were actually killing jobs. He would ask about the children's activities, remind Barbara of important upcoming events, and generally keep the connection. That made their marriage feel stable and safe. Money he made from his life of crime allowed the family to live comfortably. In a nice suburban neighborhood, they owned a large home with a swimming pool, drove new cars, and took expensive vacations. When Barbara sometimes wondered about where their wealth came from, Richard would explain that his import-export business was making a lot of money, or that he had made smart investments in money markets. Richard's legal businesses were not entirely fake. He did run several small companies that gave believable reasons for his money and travel. These businesses were real enough to pass a casual check, but their main purpose was to provide a cover for his criminal activities rather than to make a lot of legal money. The social parts of suburban life came easily to Richard. Despite his job, he and Barbara had people over regularly, hosting dinner parties and barbecues that supported their image as a successful, normal couple. Richard was charming and interesting with guests, showing knowledge about current events, sports, and other topics that made him a popular person at social events. Neighbors always described Richard as helpful and thoughtful. He would shovel snow from elderly neighbors' driveways, help with home repair projects, and generally act like a model citizen. The difference between this public personality and his professional activities was so great that it was almost unreal. The mental stress of keeping such a complete double life would have destroyed most people, but Richard seemed to be energized by keeping things separate. He developed detailed mental plans for keeping his two worlds apart. Work stress was never brought home. Family worries were never allowed to get in the way of professional jobs. The Richard Kuklinski, who tucked his children into bed at night, lived in a completely different mental space than the Iceman who froze his victims' bodies. His ability to switch between personalities was so complete that even clothes watching showed no cracks in his cover. Barbara later remembered that she never saw any proof of violence in her husband's behavior, never noticed weapons or suspicious things around their home, and never saw the cold, calculating manner that was part of his professional activities. Richard's travel schedule actually helped keep the separation between his two lives. When he was away on killing jobs, he was completely in his professional personality. When he returned home, he could fully become a husband and father. The physical separation made the mental separation easier too. Keep. The children grew up with no knowledge of their father's true job. Richard was careful never to do business from home, never to have suspicious visitors, and never to show the weapons and equipment that were vital to his work. To his children, he was simply a successful businessman who traveled a lot and provided well for his family. Barbara sometimes noticed things that did not add up in Richard's explanations of his business activities, but these worries were easily pushed away. The import-export business was complex and international, so it made sense that she would not understand all the details. Richard's confident explanations and steady success gave her comfort that whatever he was doing was both legal and profitable. The family's social circle included other successful suburban families, and the Kuklinskis fit perfectly into this community. Richard coached his children's sports teams alongside other fathers. Barbara was in school activities with other mothers, and the family went to church regularly. Their joining into normal suburban life was so complete that even trained observers would have found nothing suspicious. Going to church was another part of Richard's separation of his lives. Despite having killed dozens of people, he went to Catholic Mass with his family almost every Sunday. He went through the motions of prayer and communion with the same focus he brought to everything else. Whether this was real faith, just fitting in, or simply another part of his cover identity was not clear, even to those closest to him. The family vacations were especially important to Richard's home personality. He would plan fancy trips to Disney World, beach resorts, and other family-friendly places. During these vacations, he was completely focused on his role as husband and father, showing patience and love that would have shocked his criminal friends. The photographs from these trips show a man who looks genuinely happy and relaxed, surrounded by a loving family. Richard's relationship with each of his children was unique and carefully built. With his oldest son, Merrick, he stressed responsibility and success, preparing him for eventual success in a legal business. With his daughter, Kristen, he was protective and loving, taking pride in her school and social successes. With his youngest son, David, he was playful and encouraging, supporting his interest in sports and other activities. The children's friends were always welcome in the Kuklinski home, and Richard was popular with the neighborhood kids. He would organize games, help with school projects, and generally act as a model father figure. Parents in the neighborhood trusted him with their children and often asked for his advice on family matters. Barbara's happiness during this time was real and complete. She had married a man who seemed to adore her, provided well for their family, and shared her dreams for the future. Richard's frequent travel was a small problem compared to the good things in their life. She had no reason to think that her husband's business trips involved activities that would have horrified her. The home routine that Richard set up was remarkably steady. He would return from business trips with gifts for the family, toys for the children, jewelry, or flowers for Barbara. He would ask detailed questions about what had happened while he was away, showing real interest in the small details of family life. These homecomings were always celebrations, making the family's bond stronger and supporting Richard's role as a loving family leader. Richard's investment in his family's future went beyond day-to-day care. He set up college funds for his children, made sure Barbara would be financially safe if anything happened to him, and generally planned for long-term family stability. These were not the actions of someone who saw his family as a temporary cover. They showed a real commitment to his role as husband and father. The success of Richard's separation of lives was perhaps most clear during a family crisis, when Barbara was in the hospital for a serious illness in the early 1970s. Richard was a devoted and caring husband. He changed his professional schedule to be there for her treatment, arranged care for the children, and generally handled the crisis with the kind of skill and dedication that made their marriage stronger. Similarly, when one of the children was hurt in a school accident, Richard showed the protective feelings and emotional involvement of a normal father. He dealt with doctors, school officials, and insurance companies with the same planned skill he brought to his criminal activities. But the reason was purely a parent's concern rather than a professional need. The financial parts of keeping two separate lives required careful management. Richard had to make sure that his family's lifestyle matched his declared legal income, while also paying for the large operational needs of his criminal career. This involved complex accounting and investment, plans that kept criminal money separate from family money. Richard's legal businesses provided enough documented income to support a comfortable middle-class lifestyle. The family lived well, but not in a showy way, avoiding the kind of obvious wealth that might get unwanted attention. Richard was careful to explain any unusual spending as the result of successful investments or business deals. The weapons and equipment essential to Richard's criminal career were stored in places completely separate from his family home. He kept safe houses and storage units where he could get the tools of his trade without any risk of his family finding out. This physical separation was key to keeping the mental walls between his two lives. Communication with criminal friends was handled through secure ways that could not be traced to his family identity. Richard used payphones, mail drops, and other methods that ensured his legal life remained separate from his professional activities. He was absolutely disciplined about keeping these security rules. The stress of keeping such a complete double life might have been too much for someone else, but Richard seemed to find it energizing rather than tiring. The difference between his two worlds gave a form of mental relief. The warmth and normalcy of family life balanced the cold brutality of his professional activities. Barbara later thought that she had married a man who seemed too good to be true, caring, successful, devoted to his family, and completely reliable. Looking back, these qualities should have made her suspicious, but at the time, they simply seemed like proof of her good luck in finding such a special husband. The children's memories of their father during this period were always positive. He was involved in their lives, supportive of their interests, and generally there for important events. The occasional times he was away for business travel were accepted as a normal part of adult working life. Richard's integration into the suburban community went beyond his immediate family. He served on school committees, was in neighborhood groups, and generally acted as a citizen who cared about his community. These activities strengthened his legal identity while also providing a useful cover for his criminal activities. The success of Richard's double life was so complete that it became a source of professional pride. He took satisfaction not just in his skill as a hired killer, but in his ability to maintain such a perfect cover. The separation of lives had become an art form in itself. But as the 1970s went on, the mental strain of keeping two completely separate identities began to show small signs of stress. Richard became more secretive about certain parts of his business, more careful about his communications, and more protective of his family's privacy. These changes were small and easily explained, but they suggested that the perfect balance he had kept was becoming harder to sustain. The criminal world was changing as well. Police methods were becoming more advanced, criminal organizations were under more pressure, and the kind of freelance hired killing that had made Richard so successful was becoming riskier and harder to keep up. By the early 1980s, Richard Kuklinski had achieved something that few criminals ever manage: a successful career in the most dangerous job imaginable, combined with a genuinely happy family life. But this achievement held the seeds of its own destruction. The more successful Richard became in both worlds, the more difficult it would be to keep the separation between them. The perfect family man and the perfect killer were about to face the ultimate test of keeping their lives separate. The pressures that had been building for 2 decades were about to come together in a way that would destroy everything Richard had worked so hard to build and protect. By the late 1970s, Richard Kuklinski had changed from a freelance hired killer into one of the most trusted people in the organized crime world. His name for being reliable, secretive, and having new killing methods had reached the highest levels of multiple crime families. It was during this time that Richard became involved in some of the most important assassinations in modern Mafia history. The relationship with Roy, Damiao's crew, had grown much deeper since Richard's early jobs. Damiao, a psychopathic member of the Gambino crime family, ran what was basically a murder-for-hire business, handling killing jobs for different criminal organizations. The crew was responsible for an estimated 75 to 200 murders during their active time, making them one of the busiest killing organizations in American crime history. Richard's role in this network was unique. Unlike the other members of Damiao's crew, who were mostly street criminals moved up to killing roles, Richard worked as an independent worker. He was not tied by family loyalties or traditional Mafia rules, which made him both more valuable and more dangerous to his clients. Damiao recognized Richard's amazing abilities and began giving him the crew's most difficult jobs. These were not simple killing jobs, but complex assassination plans that required advanced planning, special techniques, and total reliability. Richard's success rate was perfect. Every target given to him died exactly as planned within the agreed-upon time, and without creating problems for his clients. The technical skill that Richard brought to these high-profile jobs set new standards for hired killing. While traditional Mafia murders were often brutal and public, meant to send messages of fear, Richard's work was known for its quietness and precision. His victims would simply disappear or die in ways that looked accidental or natural, leaving police with no evidence of murder. One of Richard's most important early jobs involved the killing of a federal informant who was giving information about organized crime activities to the police. The target was under light watch and kept a fairly low profile, but his continued help with federal authorities was a huge threat to multiple crime families. The challenge was not just killing the informant, but doing it in a way that would not immediately tell the police that their source had been found out. If the murder was too obvious, it would alert authorities to investigate all the cases the informant had been involved with, possibly revealing other criminal operations. Richard's solution was, as usual, clever. He studied the informant's medical history and found that the man had a heart problem that required regular medicine. Richard got one of the medicine refills, replacing the prescribed heart medicine with pills that looked identical but had strong poison instead of the life-saving drug. When the informant suffered what looked like a massive heart attack during a normal morning walk, investigators found nothing suspicious. The autopsy showed heart failure, which matched his known medical condition. The poison Richard had used broke down into things that naturally occur in the body during heart problems. The murder was never found, and the informant's help with the police simply ended without raising any alarms. This type of advanced assassination became Richard's specialty. He could kill targets in ways that left no proof of murder, protecting his clients from investigation while permanently solving their problems. The demand for such work was huge, and Richard charged top prices for his unique abilities. The relationship with organized crime families gave Richard access to resources and information that made him much more effective. Crime families had large networks of informants within the police, government agencies, and other places. This information allowed Richard to plan his operations with amazing precision. When a target was being watched, Richard would know the details of the surveillance operation. When police were investigating a particular case, he would know what proof they had and what they were looking for. This information allowed him to stay multiple steps ahead of any investigation, changing his methods to take advantage of weaknesses in police procedures. Richard's involvement with the assassination of Carmine Galante is one of the most important organized crime murders of the modern era. Galante was the boss of the Bonanno crime family and had been fighting a violent battle to expand his territory at the cost of other New York families. By 1979, his aggressive actions had made him too many enemies, and the commission, the ruling body of New York's crime families, decided he had to be killed. The murder took place on July 12, 1979, at Joe and Mary's Italian restaurant in Brooklyn. Galante was eating with friends when multiple gunmen entered the restaurant and opened fire. The assassination was brutal and public, meant to send a clear message about what happens when you challenge the established order. Richard's role in the Galante murder has never been proven for sure, but he later claimed to have been one of the gunmen involved in the operation. Whether or not this claim was true, the Galante assassination was the type of high-profile job that Richard was increasingly being asked to handle. The murder of Paul Castellano 5 years later was even more important. Castellano was the boss of the Gambino crime family and one of the most powerful criminal figures in America. His assassination outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan on December 16, 1985, was planned by John Gotti as part of an internal power struggle within the Gambino family. Richard's claimed involvement in the Castellano murder shows the level of trust that organized crime leaders had developed in his abilities. Assassinating a sitting crime family boss required amazing planning, teamwork, and action. The operation had to kill not just Castellano, but also his bodyguard, and it had to be finished before the police could respond. The Castellano assassination was carried out with military precision. Multiple gunmen approached the targets as they got out of their car, killing both men with coordinated gunfire before disappearing into the Manhattan traffic. The operation lasted less than 2 minutes, but changed the entire power structure of New York's organized crime families. Whether or not Richard was directly involved in these specific assassinations, his name was certainly made better by being linked to such high-profile operations. Criminal organizations throughout the country began calling him for their most secret killing jobs. Richard's relationship with the Chicago outfit shows his growing influence within organized crime circles. The Chicago family had heard about Richard's new techniques and absolute reliability from their New York friends. When they needed a particularly difficult job done, they were willing to pay Richard's high prices for his services. The Chicago job involved killing a government official who was investigating organized crime activities. The target had a lot of security protection and was extremely careful about his personal safety. Traditional assassination methods would have been almost impossible to carry out successfully. Richard's approach to this job showed his ability to change his methods to get past any security measures. Instead of trying a direct attack on the heavily protected target, he focused on the official's family members who had less security, but whose safety was very important to the target's peace of mind. Richard did not actually harm any family members, but he made his presence known in quiet ways that made it clear he could reach them whenever he chose. A few carefully placed watchings, some mysteriously delivered messages, and strategic appearances in places where family members would notice him were enough to send the threat. When Richard finally approached the government official directly, the man understood immediately that fighting would be useless. His family's safety depended on his cooperation, and Richard had shown that no amount of official protection could keep his loved ones safe. The official's death was finally ruled a suicide, but it effectively ended the investigation that had threatened the Chicago crime family's operations. This type of mental warfare became another signature part of Richard's operations. He understood that the threat of violence was often more effective than violence itself, especially when dealing with targets who had families or other weaknesses that could be used. The 1980s were the peak of Richard's involvement with organized crime, families. He was handling jobs from multiple families at the same time, often juggling several complex assassination plots at the same time. His income from these activities was huge, easily equal to millions of dollars in today's money. But success at this level brought new challenges and dangers. Richard was now working directly with some of the most paranoid and dangerous criminals in America. These were men who would kill their own family members if they suspected they were. Betrayed, and Richard's position as an outsider made him open to their suspicions. The organized crime world was also becoming more and more dangerous due to police pressure. Federal agencies had developed advanced surveillance and information gathering abilities that made traditional criminal activities riskier. The same high-profile nature of Richard's jobs that had made him so valuable also made him a more attractive target for investigation. Richard began to notice increased police attention around some of his activities. Surveillance that had once been occasional and unfocused became more persistent, and professional phone conversations that had once been secure now seemed to carry risks. The criminal world that had given Richard such profitable opportunities was showing signs of stress. The relationship with Damiao's crew began to get worse as well. Damiao himself was becoming more and more unpredictable and violent, even by the standards of his job. His paranoia was reaching levels that made him dangerous to his own friends, and Richard began to question the wisdom of keeping such close ties to such an unstable person. In 1983, Damiao himself was murdered, likely on orders from higher ranking members of the Gambino family who had grown tired of his unpredictable behavior. The murder sent shock waves through the organized crime world and marked the beginning of the end for many of the relationships that had kept Richard's career going. With Damiao gone, Richard lost his most important connection to the Gambino family's leadership. Other organized crime families began to distance themselves from freelance workers, preferring to handle killing jobs with their own trusted members rather than outside workers who might become problems. The changing criminal world forced Richard to change his business model. Instead of relying mainly on organized crime jobs, he began accepting jobs from a wider range of criminal clients. Drug dealers, corrupt business executives, and other criminals who needed killing services became his new customer base. This change brought new risks, but also new opportunities. Richard's name had grown beyond organized crime circles, and there was a big demand for his services from criminals who could not get to traditional mafia resources. These clients were often willing to pay even higher rates than organized crime. Families, especially for Richard's specialized techniques. But the shift also made Richard's activities more visible to the police. Mafia jobs were often protected by the organizations. Security measures and information networks. Freelance work exposed Richard to more attention and investigation. The high-profile nature of Richard's career had also created another problem. His success had made him a legend within criminal circles. But legends attract attention from the police as well as potential clients. By the mid-1980s, Richard Kuklinski's name as the Iceman had reached the ears of federal investigators, who were beginning to piece together the size of his activities. The very success that had made Richard one of the most feared hired killers in America was about to become the base of the case. That would bring him down. The high-profile jobs, the new techniques, and the large network of criminal relationships had created a trail of proof that determined investigators could follow. The Iceman's golden age was coming to an end, but the final act would prove to be the most dramatic of all. The investigation that would finally bring down Richard Kuklinski began not with a big plan, but with a normal look at seemingly unrelated criminal activities. In the early 1980s, federal police agencies were increasing their work against organized crime, and several ongoing investigations had found patterns that suggested the existence of a highly professional, hired killer working throughout the Northeast. First clues were small and not direct. Multiple unsolved murders across several states shared certain features. Victims who had disappeared for weeks or months before their bodies were found, unusual weapon choices, and forensic proof that suggested the killer had advanced technical knowledge. More interestingly, several investigations had found mentions of a freelance assassin known only as the Iceman. An ATF agent named Dominic Polifrone first heard Richard's name during an investigation into illegal gun sales. Polifrone was an experienced undercover agent who had successfully gotten inside various criminal organizations, and he understood that the Iceman mentions he was hearing meant something important. The respectful way that hardened criminals used when talking about this person suggested someone with amazing abilities and a great reputation. Breakthrough came when investigators connected Richard to a car theft and murder plan involving Gary Smith and Daniel Deppner. Smith and Deppner were small-time criminals who had asked Richard to join a stolen car operation. The plan involved stealing luxury cars, changing their identification numbers, and reselling them through a network of corrupt dealers. For Richard, the car theft operation was a relatively low-risk way to make extra money while keeping his main focus on hired killing. However, he quickly became frustrated with Smith and Deppner's incompetence and unprofessional behavior. The two men were careless with security, bragged about their activities, and generally were the kind of risk that Richard had spent decades avoiding. The situation became a crisis when Smith and Deppner began discussing their connection with Richard in conversations that could have been overheard by police. Richard realized that his partners had become problems who could possibly reveal his entire operation. His solution was, as usual, direct and permanent. In December 1982, Richard arranged to meet Gary Smith at a hotel in northern New Jersey, supposedly to discuss their ongoing business relationship. Smith arrived expecting a normal criminal meeting, but instead walked into his own killing. Richard had prepared the hotel room carefully, making sure that the meeting would be private and that proof could be controlled. The murder itself showed Richard's continuing new ideas and killing techniques. Instead of using normal weapons that might be traced or leave clear proof, Richard had prepared a hamburger laced with cyanide. He offered the poisoned food to Smith as a friendly gesture, then waited patiently as the poison took effect. Smith's death was quick, but not instant, giving Richard the chance to watch the effects of the poison and improve his understanding of the technique. The body was gotten rid of in a way that would confuse investigators about the time and place of death, using methods that Richard had perfected over years of professional killing. Daniel Deppner's killing followed a similar pattern, but Richard changed his approach to avoid creating patterns that could be found. Deppner was killed using different methods and gotten rid of in a different location, making sure that even if both murders were eventually connected, investigators would have a hard time proving Richard's involvement. However, the car theft operation had gotten police attention before Richard could completely clean up the loose ends. Federal investigators had been tracking the stolen car network and had identified Smith and Deppner as important players in the operation. When both men disappeared, their absence was noticed immediately. The investigation into the missing criminals revealed connections to Richard through various business friends and criminal contacts. More importantly, Investigators discovered that both Smith and Deppner had been heard bragging about their connection with someone they called the Iceman, the same mysterious figure that had appeared in multiple other criminal investigations. Agent Polifrone realized that the Smith and Deppner disappearances gave an opportunity to investigate the Iceman more directly. If Richard was indeed responsible for the murders, he might be open to an undercover approach designed to draw him into activities. The undercover operation that followed was one of the most dangerous and complex investigations in federal law enforcement history. Polifrone would have to convince a professional killer, someone who had survived decades in the most paranoid criminal world imaginable, that he was a real criminal looking for assassination services. The challenge was huge. Richard's survival had depended on his ability to spot police operations, and he had developed advanced techniques for checking out potential clients and business friends. Any mistake by Polifrone could result not just in the failure of the investigation, but in his own death. Polifrone's approach was planned and patient. Instead of approaching Richard directly, he spent months building a criminal identity that would not be questioned. He made connections with known criminals, took part in minor illegal activities to build trust, and generally created the kind of background that Richard would expect from a real client. The first contact came through go-betweens who could confirm Polifrone's authenticity. Richard was always cautious about new clients, but the recommendations from trusted criminal friends gave the credibility needed to arrange a first meeting. When Polifrone finally met Richard face-to-face in late 1985, the meeting was carefully planned to look normal while actually gathering important proof. Polifrone wore recording equipment that captured Richard's statements, but the technology had to be advanced enough to avoid being found by someone as security conscious. As Richard the conversations between Polifrone and Richard revealed the full size of Richard's criminal activities, speaking freely to someone he believed was a fellow criminal. Richard discussed his techniques, his experience, and his willingness to handle different types of killing jobs. The recordings gave investigators direct proof of Richard's involvement in multiple murders. More importantly, Richard agreed to accept a contract killing job from Polifrone. The target was fake, but Richard's acceptance of the job and his detailed discussions of how he would complete the murder gave prosecutors clear proof of his criminal plans and methods. The undercover operation lasted for over a year, with Polifrone gradually building Richard's trust and encouraging him to reveal more details about his criminal career. Richard, believing he was dealing with a fellow professional, shared information about weapons, techniques, and specific murders that gave investigators a full understanding of his activities. The investigation required amazing security measures to protect Polifrone's safety. Richard was known to be extremely dangerous, and any suspicion about Polifrone's true identity could have resulted in immediate attack. Federal agents kept constant watch on all meetings, and Polifrone was allowed to use deadly force if his cover was blown. The mental pressure on Polifrone was immense. He was spending hours in conversation with a man who had killed dozens of people and would not hesitate to add another victim to his list. The recordings captured Richard's matter-of-fact discussions of torture, murder, and body disposal in chilling detail. As the investigation went on, Richard began to reveal information about high-profile murders that had never been solved. His claims about involvement in the assassinations of organized crime figures gave investigators new leads in cold cases that had frustrated police for years. Proof gathered during the undercover operation was overwhelming. Federal prosecutors had recordings of Richard discussing multiple murders, agreeing to commit new murders, and detailing techniques that matched unsolved cases across multiple states. The case against him was almost impossible to beat. December 17th, 1986. Federal agents moved to arrest Richard Kuklinski. The operation was planned with military precision, involving multiple agencies and a lot of firepower. Law enforcement officials understood that they were dealing with one of the most dangerous criminals in American history, and they took no chances with the arrest. Richard was arrested without any trouble, but the investigation team stayed on high alert throughout the process. Even in handcuffs, Richard was a major threat, and his reputation for violence and escape attempts made every moment of the arrest operation possibly dangerous. The arrest shocked Richard's family and neighbors, who had no idea that the successful businessman and devoted father they knew was actually one of America's busiest hired killers. Barbara Kuklinski and her children learned about Richard's true job from news reports, discovering that the man they loved had been living a detailed lie for decades. The media attention around Richard's arrest was intense. The story of the Iceman, a suburban family man who is secretly a professional killer, captured the public's imagination and became one of the most widely reported criminal cases of the decade. Difference between Richard's public and private personalities became a symbol of the hidden evil that could exist in seemingly normal communities. Federal prosecutors faced the challenge of presenting a case that involved decades of criminal activity, multiple states, and a defendant who had become a legendary figure in criminal circles. The proof was large but complex, requiring careful presentation to help juries understand the size and importance of Richard's crimes. The investigation continued even after Richard's arrest. As law enforcement agencies worked to solve cold cases that might be connected to his activities, the information Richard had revealed during the undercover operation provided leads in dozens of unsolved murders, and investigators were confident that the full extent of his criminal career was far greater than what they could prove in court. The arrest of Richard Kuklinski marked the end of one of the most successful criminal careers in American history. For over 2 decades, he had worked as a professional killer while keeping up the appearance of a normal suburban life. His capture required one of the most advanced undercover operations ever done, and even then, success was far from certain. The Iceman's reign of terror was over, but the legal trials that followed would reveal even more shocking details about the size of his crimes and the mental tricks that had allowed him to kill so many people while appearing to be a devoted family man. Operation Iceman had succeeded in capturing one of America's most dangerous criminals. But the full story of Richard Kuklinski's crimes would take years to unfold. Legal trials following Richard Kuklinski's arrest revealed the true size of one of the largest criminal careers in American history. As prosecutors built their cases and Richard faced the reality of life in prison, the careful separation that had allowed him to keep his double life began to fall apart, leading to confessions that shocked even experienced police professionals. The first trial in 1988 focused on murders that prosecutors could prove with physical proof and witness stories. Richard was charged with the murders of Gary Smith, Daniel Deppner, George Malaband, Louis Masquet, and Paul Hoffman. The proof against him was overwhelming, built mainly on the recordings from Agent Polyphrone's undercover operation and forensic proof that connected Richard to the crime scenes. During the trial, Richard's defense team faced an impossible task. The recorded conversations captured Richard discussing murders in clear detail, showing knowledge that only the killer could have. The forensic proof, including the new freezing techniques that had given Richard his nickname, provided additional proof of his involvement in the murders. Richard's behavior during the trial showed the same cold separation that had marked his criminal career. He showed no emotion when prosecution witnesses described the suffering of his victims, No remorse when proof of his brutal methods was presented, and no fear when facing the possibility of being executed. To watchers, he seemed more interested in the technical parts of the prosecution's case than in what could happen to him. The jury talked for only a few hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Richard was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, avoiding the death penalty through plea deals that his lawyers had arranged. Sentencing marked the end of Richard Kuklinski's freedom, but the beginning of a new part of his story. Prison life was a dramatic change for someone who had spent decades controlling every part of his world. Richard was held in a maximum security prison where his reputation as a professional killer gave him both protection and loneliness. Other inmates feared him, but prison officials were equally careful around someone with his history and abilities. It was during his early years in prison that Richard began the confessions that would make him known as one of America's busiest serial killers. At first, these confessions seemed to be driven by boredom and a desire for attention. Richard had spent his entire adult life as an active, controlling person, and the limits of prison life left him with few ways to use his intelligence and energy. The first detailed interviews were done by law enforcement officials trying to solve cold cases that might be connected to Richard's activities. Detectives from multiple areas visited the prison, hoping that Richard might provide information about unsolved murders that had frustrated their investigations for years. Richard's approach to these interviews was, as usual, calculating. He understood that his confessions could give him certain benefits: better prison conditions, media attention, and chances to show his intelligence and skill. He gave out information strategically, always keeping some power over the people questioning him. The number of Richard's claimed victims was shocking. He eventually confessed to over 100 murders, over a career that lasted more than 3 decades. The victims included criminal friends who had become problems, random strangers who had somehow made him angry, and contract targets whose killings had been arranged by various criminal organizations. What made Richard's confessions particularly chilling was not just the number of victims, but the matter-of-fact way he used when describing the murders. He discussed torture, cutting up bodies, and creative killing methods with the same lack of emotion that others might use to describe routine business activities. The mental separation was complete and total. HBO documentaries began showing Richard's prison interviews, bringing his story to a national audience that was fascinated by the difference between his suburban family man personality and his career as a professional killer. The Iceman tapes, 1992. The Iceman Confesses, 2001. And The Iceman and the Psychiatrist, 2003, gave viewers amazing access to the mind of a serial killer. During these filmed interviews, Richard showed the same charm and intelligence that had made him such an effective criminal. He could discuss his murders with perfect precision, then switch smoothly to expressing love for his family or concern about current events. The separation of his life that had defined his freedom continued even in prison. One of the most revealing parts of Richard's confessions was his description of the mental tricks that had allowed him to kill so many people while keeping his family relationships. He explained that he had developed the ability to completely separate different parts of his personality, using only the thoughts and emotions right for each situation. The killing for me was secondary, Richard explained in one interview. But the figuring it out, the challenge, the stalking, and doing it right successfully, that excited me a lot. This statement showed that for Richard, murder had been mainly a mental game, a complex problem to be solved, rather than an emotional release or expression of anger. The psychiatric tests done during Richard's imprisonment gave insights into the mental factors that had shaped his criminal career. Dr. Park Dietz, a famous forensic psychiatrist, did extensive interviews with Richard, exploring the childhood trauma, things passed down from his parents, and environmental factors that had created such a busy killer. The tests revealed that Richard fit the clinical description for antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy, conditions that explained his lack of empathy and his ability to commit extreme violence without an emotional response. However, his case was unusual even among psychopaths because of the amazing separation of his mind that had allowed him to keep loving family relationships. Richard's relationship with his family during his imprisonment became another subject of intense interest. Barbara and the children continued to visit him regularly, and Richard kept his role as a caring husband and father, even from behind bars. The psychological complexity of these relationships fascinated researchers and documentary makers. In 2003, 15 years after his first conviction, Richard was tried again for the 1980 murder of Peter Calabro, a police detective who had been investigating organized crime activities. The case had remained unsolved for over 2 decades, but Richard's confessions had given investigators new information. That led to more charges. The second trial revealed even more details about Richard's criminal methods and his connections to organized crime families. Prosecutors presented evidence that Richard had been one of the most active hired killers on the East Coast, handling assassination jobs for multiple crime families. While keeping his cover as a legal businessman, Richard was found guilty in the Calabro murder and received another life sentence, ensuring that he would never be released from prison, no matter what future legal developments happened. The impact of Richard's crimes on his family was devastating and long-lasting. Barbara Kuklinski struggled to match the man she had loved and trusted with the monster revealed. In court and media coverage, the psychological pain of discovering that her husband of over 20 years had been leading a double life as a serial killer required a lot of therapy and support. The children faced their own unique challenges in accepting their father's true nature. They had grown up with genuine love and affection from Richard, making it difficult to accept that the same hands that had helped with homework and tucked them into bed had also tortured and killed dozens of people. The mental conflict was almost impossible to handle. Merrick, Kristen, and David Kuklinski each developed different ways of coping with their father's legacy. Some chose to keep relationships with Richard during his imprisonment, while others found it necessary to cut ties completely. The family was forever changed by the revelation of Richard's crimes, and the healing process would take decades. The broader impact of Richard's case on law enforcement was significant and lasting. His new killing methods, particularly the body freezing technique, forced forensic investigators to develop new approaches to murder. Investigations, crime scene rules were updated to account for the possibility that bodies had been deliberately frozen to confuse time of death estimates. Richard's advanced operational security measures also influenced law enforcement training and procedures. His ability to keep multiple identities, use secure communications, and avoid being caught for decades highlighted weaknesses in traditional criminal investigation methods. Police agencies began developing new surveillance techniques and undercover rules based on lessons learned from the Kuklinski case. Psychological research done on Richard contributed greatly to the understanding of criminal psychology, particularly about the separation of the mind and the ability of some individuals to keep seemingly normal relationships while engaging in extreme violence. His case became a subject of study in criminal justice programs and psychiatric training throughout the country. Throughout his time in prison, Richard continued to provide information about unsolved crimes, though investigators had to carefully check his claims against physical proof and witness stories. Some of his confessions proved to be true and led to the resolution of cold cases, while others seemed to be lies designed to boost his reputation or get attention. The question of Richard's total victim count remained a point of debate among law enforcement professionals. While he claimed to have killed over 200 people during his criminal career, investigators could only confirm a small part of these murders. The true number of his victims would likely never be known for sure. Richard's health began to get much worse in the early 2000s as the stress of prison and his increasing age took their toll. He developed various medical conditions that required ongoing treatment, and his physical condition worsened noticeably from the big figure he had been during his criminal career. In 2005, Richard agreed to testify against Sammy the Bull Gravano, the former Gambino crime family underboss, who had become a government witness but was later arrested on new charges. Richard's testimony was expected to provide crucial evidence about organized crime activities and could have resulted in major convictions. However, on March 5, 2006, just days before he was scheduled to testify, Richard Kuklinski was found dead in his prison cell. He was 70 years old and had served 18 years of his life sentence. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, but the timing raised suspicions among some investigators and media watchers. Situation around Richard's death fueled conspiracy theories that he had been murdered to prevent his testimony against Gravano and other organized crime figures. The timing of his death, coming just before important testimony that could have damaged powerful criminal organizations, seemed too convenient to be a coincidence. Prison officials and medical examiners insisted that Richard's death was due to natural causes related to his worsening health conditions. However, the suspicious timing and Richard's own paranoid statements about threats against his life kept talk alive about the true circumstances of his death. Richard's death marked the end of one of the most extraordinary criminal careers in American history. His legacy as the Iceman would continue to fascinate true crime fans, researchers, and the general public for decades to come. The story of a suburban family man who was secretly one of America's busiest serial killers became a warning tale about the hidden evil that could exist in seemingly normal communities. The investigation into Richard's crimes continued even after his death, as law enforcement agencies worked to solve remaining cold cases that might be connected to his activities. The information he had provided during his confessions, combined with new forensic techniques, led to the resolution of several additional murders. Barbara Kuklinski eventually wrote a book about her experience being married to Richard, providing insights into their relationship and her struggle to understand how she could have been so completely fooled. Her story offered a unique viewpoint on the psychological tricks and mental separation that had allowed Richard to maintain his double life for so many years. The children also began speaking publicly about their experiences, sharing their views on growing up with a father who was at the same time loving and monstrous. Their stories provided valuable insights into the long-term psychological impact of discovering that a trusted family member was capable of extreme violence. The HBO documentaries featuring Richard's prison interviews remained popular with true crime audiences, providing a chilling glimpse into the mind of a serial killer. The recordings captured Richard's matter-of-fact discussions of murder and torture, showing the complete lack of empathy that had made his crimes possible. Academic researchers continued to study Richard's case for insights into criminal psychology, particularly focusing on the ways that had allowed him to separate his violent activities from his family. Relationships doubt his ability to maintain real emotional connections with his wife and children, while at the same time torturing and killing. Strangers remained a fascinating and disturbing psychological event. Law enforcement training programs included lessons learned from the Kuklinski case, particularly regarding the identification and investigation of highly advanced criminal operations. Richard's methods had been so advanced that traditional police work had been unable to find his activities, requiring new undercover operations and new investigative techniques. Legacy of Richard Kuklinski goes far beyond the immediate impact of his crimes. His case fundamentally changed how law enforcement agencies approach serial murder investigations, how forensic scientists examine crime scenes, and how psychologists understand the mind-separating abilities of certain personality disorders. Story of the Iceman also served as a reminder that evil can exist behind the most innocent-looking faces. Richard's ability to maintain his reputation as a devoted family man while carrying out one of the most brutal criminal careers in American history challenged ideas about how dangerous individuals show themselves to society. For the families of Richard's victims, his death brought some closure, but could never fully heal the wounds created by their losses. Many victims' families had waited decades for answers about their loved ones' disappearances, and Richard's confessions provided some resolution to cases that had long been considered unsolvable. The true crime community continues to analyze and discuss Richard's case, finding new insights and details in the large amount of documentation of his crimes and confessions. Books, documentaries, podcasts, and academic papers have examined every aspect of his criminal career and its impact on law enforcement, psychology, and society. Richard Kuklinski died as he had lived, surrounded by mystery and controversy. Questions about whether his death was natural or planned added one final layer of mystery to a story that had captured public attention for decades. The Iceman's legacy would continue to chill and fascinate long after his death. Story of Richard Leonard Kuklinski remains one of the most disturbing and fascinating cases in American crime history. Over the course of more than 3 decades, he changed from an abused child into one of the busiest and most advanced serial killers the nation has ever seen, all while keeping up the appearance of a devoted suburban family man. Richard's case challenges our basic ideas about what evil is and the ability of dangerous people to hide in plain sight. The man who could torture victims to death without showing the slightest emotion was the same person who coached Little League teams and never missed his children's school performances. Mental separation required to keep such very different personalities is hard to explain and continues to fascinate researchers decades after his crimes were revealed. The technical skill of Richard's killing methods set him apart from other serial killers of his time. His new ideas in body preservation, poison delivery systems, and forensic fooling measures forced law enforcement agencies to develop new investigative techniques and crime scene rules. The nickname Iceman became a term for cold, calculating murder done with scientific precision. Perhaps most chilling was Richard's complete lack of feeling bad for his actions, even when facing life in prison and the destruction of his family relationships. He showed no real regret for the suffering he had caused. His prison interviews revealed a man who saw murder as a mental challenge rather than a moral wrong, someone who took pride in his professional successes, no matter how horrible they were. The impact on Richard's family serves as a reminder that the victims of serial killers are more than just those who were directly murdered. Barbara, Merrick, Kristen, and David Kuklinski were forced to face the reality that the person they loved most was capable of unimaginable cruelty. Their struggle to accept these conflicting truths continues. To this day, law enforcement's success in capturing Richard required one of the most dangerous and advanced undercover operations in federal law enforcement history. Agent Dominic Polifrone's willingness to spend months in close contact with a professional killer, knowing that any mistake could result in his own death, showed the amazing commitment needed to bring such advanced criminals to justice. The mysterious circumstances around Richard's death added one final layer of mystery to a case already filled with unanswered questions. Whether he died from natural causes or was silenced to prevent damaging testimony against organized crime figures may never be known for sure. Richard Kuklinski's legacy goes far beyond the immediate impact of his crimes. His case fundamentally changed how we understand the psychology of serial killers, the abilities of organized crime, and the hidden dangers that can exist in seemingly normal communities. The techniques he pioneered influenced both criminal methods and law enforcement response plans. The story of the Iceman serves as a strong reminder that monsters do not always look like monsters, can be successful businessmen, devoted fathers, and respected members of their communities. The most dangerous hunters are often those who appear most normal, hiding their true nature behind carefully built covers of respectability. As we think about Richard Kuklinski's extraordinary criminal career, we are left with deep questions about the nature of evil, how much we can trust what we see, and the hidden depths of the human mind. His story continues to disturb and fascinate because it forces us to face the uncomfortable reality that we may never truly know the people closest to us. The Iceman's reign of terror ended with his arrest in 1986, but his legacy continues to influence our understanding of crime, psychology, and the dark abilities of the human mind. His story remains a masterclass in deception, mental separation, and the terrifying skill with which some people can destroy lives while keeping up appearances of complete normalcy. In the end, Richard Leonard Kuklinski stands as one of the most successful and advanced serial killers in American history. A title as chilling as it is true, his story serves as an eternal warning about the monsters that may be hiding behind the most innocent faces in our communities. As we reach the end of this amazing journey into the mind and methods of Richard Kuklinski, we are left standing at the meeting point of horror and fascination, staring into a dark place that stares back with the cold, calculating eyes of the Iceman himself. This is not just the end of a documentary. It is the final chapter in understanding one of the most complex and terrifying criminal minds in human history. What makes Richard Kuklinski's story so uniquely disturbing is not just the number of bodies, though by his own words, it was more than 200 souls. It is not just the new and brutal nature of his methods, though the freezing technique that earned him his famous nickname changed both criminal methods and forensic investigation. What truly chills the blood is the realization that for over 30 years, evil itself lived among us, coached our children's baseball teams, went to PTA meetings, and carved the Thanksgiving turkey with the same hands that had choked the life from dozens of human beings. Think about that for a moment. Really let it sink in. While you were growing up, getting married, starting careers, and raising families, Richard Kuklinski was perfecting the art of murder. He was developing new ways to kill, trying out poisons that could drop a grown man in seconds, and freezing bodies to confuse investigators about when his victims had actually died. and then he was going home to help his daughter with her math homework. This separation of his mind, this ability to completely separate the monster from the man, is something far more terrifying than simple psychopathy. It suggests that the ability for ultimate evil can exist with genuine love, that someone can feel real affection for their children while feeling absolutely nothing for the strangers they torture to death. It challenges every idea we have about human nature and the visible signs of a bad person. Barbara. Kuklinski lived with a serial killer for over 20 years and never knew. His children grew up with bedtime stories from a Chalries man who had just returned from cutting up a human being. His neighbors borrowed tools from someone who used those same tools to get rid of bodies. The soccer moms chatting with Barbara at weekend games had no idea they were speaking to the wife of America's busiest hired killer. How is this possible? How does someone keep up such a perfect deception for decades? The answer is an understanding that Richard Kuklinski was not simply hiding his true nature. He was genuinely living multiple real versions of himself. The loving father was not an act. It was real. The devoted husband was not a performance. Those feelings were real. The helpful neighbor was not a cover. Richard truly did care about his place in the community. This is what makes his case so uniquely terrifying and psychologically important. Most criminals who live double lives are constantly acting, always aware they are playing a role. Richard had somehow developed the ability to fully become different people, using only the thoughts, feelings, and moral rules right for each situation. When he was torturing a victim, the part of his mind that loved his children simply did not exist. When he was reading bedtime stories, the killer was completely asleep. The meaning of this psychological event goes far beyond true crime. Fascination. It forces us to face uncomfortable questions about the people in our own lives. That coworker who seems so dedicated to family values, what do they do when no one is watching? The neighbor who is always willing to help with home repairs, what skills might they have learned that they are not sharing? The coach who is so great with kids, what does he think about when he is alone? Richard Kuklinski's story teaches us that evil does not announce itself. It does not wear dark clothing or speak in scary tones. It does not live in lonely cabins or abandoned warehouses. Evil can drive a minivan to soccer practice. It can go to parent-teacher conferences and church services. It can kiss you goodnight and mean it, even if those same lips spoke words of torture to a victim just hours earlier. Technical skill of Richard's crimes also deserves deeper thought. This was not a man who killed in fits of rage or moments of passion. Every murder was a carefully planned operation with backups, backup plans, and detailed disposal rules. He studied his victims like a hunter studying prey, learning their routines, finding their weaknesses, and attacking at the perfect moment to ensure success. His new ideas in killing techniques were remarkable and terrifying. The cyanide delivery systems he developed were years ahead of anything police had seen. The body freezing method was so effective that it is still studied in forensic science programs today. His operational security measures were advanced enough to keep him free for over 3 decades while committing hundreds of serious crimes. But perhaps most chillingly, Richard genuinely enjoyed the mental challenge of murder. He took pride in solving the complex problems that each killing presented. How to approach a heavily guarded target, how to get rid of a body without leaving proof, how to kill someone in a crowded restaurant without anyone noticing. These were not moral questions for Richard. They were puzzles to be solved, problems to be overcome with intelligence and creativity. The relationship between Richard and organized crime families also reveals something disturbing about the criminal world that existed in America. During his active years, the Mafia were not just thugs, running illegal gambling operations. They were advanced criminal businesses that required specialized services. Richard filled a crucial spot in this world, providing killing services that allowed these organizations to operate without fear of punishment. The fact that Richard could maintain business relationships with paranoid, violent crime bosses while also keeping his suburban family life speaks to mind-separating abilities that are almost supernatural. Roy DeMeo and other organized crime figures trusted Richard with their most secret killing jobs, never suspecting that their reliable assassin was also a little league. Coach and devoted father. The investigation that finally brought Richard down required amazing courage and new ideas from law enforcement. Agent Dominic Polifrone spent over a year in close contact with a man who could have killed him without a second thought or regret. The recordings that came from this operation provided an amazing glimpse into the mind of a professional killer, capturing conversations that revealed the true size of Richard's criminal career. Even today, decades after his arrest, law enforcement agencies are still working to solve cold cases that might be connected to Richard's activities. The full extent of his killing career will likely never be known, but his impact on criminal justice procedures and forensic science continues to influence investigations around the world. The psychological research done on Richard Kuklinski has contributed greatly to our understanding of antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy, and the ways that allow some individuals to commit extreme violence while keeping seemingly normal relationships. His case is studied in psychology programs, criminal justice courses, and law enforcement training academies as an example of how advanced and dangerous certain types of criminals can become. For the families of Richard's victims, his story provides both closure and continued pain. Many families waited decades for answers about their loved ones' disappearances, and Richard's confessions finally provided some resolution. But knowing that their family members suffered at the hands of someone so cold and calculating adds another layer of trauma to their losses. Richard's own family, Barbara and his 3 children, faced the impossible task of matching their love for a man with the horrible reality of what he had done. The psychological impact of discovering that someone you trust completely has been living a lie of such a huge size is difficult to understand. Their healing process continues decades later, and their courage in speaking publicly about their experiences has helped other families dealing with similar revelations. The mystery around Richard's death adds one final layer of mystery to an already extraordinary story. Was his death from natural causes, as officials claimed? Or was he silenced to prevent damaging testimony against organized crime figures? The timing of his death, just days before he was scheduled to testify, seems too convenient to be a coincidence. But perhaps it is fitting that Richard Kuklinski's story ends with a question mark. The same mystery and uncertainty that marked his entire criminal career. As we close this investigation into the life and crimes of the Iceman, we are left with more questions than answers. How many other Richard Kuklinskis are living among us right now? How many seemingly normal, successful, well-liked community members are hiding dark secrets that would horrify their neighbors? How well do we really know the people closest to us? These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary ones. Richard Kuklinski's story forces us to face the reality that evil can wear any face, live in any neighborhood, and hide behind any cover. The most dangerous hunters are often those who appear most normal, most trustworthy, and most a part of our communities. But perhaps there is also a lesson of hope in this story. Despite Richard's advanced deception and decades of successful mental separation, he was eventually caught, The combined efforts of dedicated law enforcement professionals, new investigation techniques, and old-fashioned police work finally brought one of America's most dangerous criminals to justice. The story of Richard Leonard Kuklinski, husband, father, neighbor, and serial killer will continue to fascinate and horrify future generations. It stands as a monument to the darkest abilities of the human mind and a warning about the monsters that may be hiding behind the most innocent faces. In the end, the Iceman's legacy is written in the lives he destroyed, the families he shattered, and the comfortable ideas about human nature that his case forever broke. He proved that evil does not announce itself, that it knocks on your door with a smile, helps with your groceries, and asks about your children's school performance. And then, when you least expect it, and your guard is completely down, it shows you what it is really capable of. The monster was real. A monster was among us. The monster might still be. Stay watchful, stay questioning, and never forget that the most dangerous hunters are often those who appear most normal. The Iceman's story ends, but the questions it raises will haunt us forever. What did you think of this journey into one of the darkest corners of the human mind? Did Richard Kuklinski's story change how you view the people around you? Share your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. Every viewpoint adds to our group's understanding of these complex psychological events. If you have made it through this entire investigation, you are clearly someone who likes deep, unflinching looks at criminal psychology. Our next documentary explores the case of Jeffrey Dahmer, another monster who hid behind a cover of normalcy while committing unimaginable crimes. Make sure you are subscribed with notifications turned on so you do not miss any of our detailed true crime investigations. For those looking for more content like this, explore our complete playlist. Each case offers unique insights into the darker parts of human nature and the dedicated professionals who work to bring dangerous criminals to justice. If this documentary connected with you, please share it with others who like serious, well-researched true crime content. Your support helps us continue producing these in-depth investigations that go far beyond surface-level drama to explore the complex psychological and social factors that create monsters among us. Remember to like this video if it gave you new insights or viewpoints, and do not forget to ring that notification bell. We release new long-form documentaries every day, each one a deep dive into cases that have shaped our understanding of criminal behavior and investigative techniques. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and always remember the most important questions are often the most uncomfortable ones. Good night, and may your dreams be free of ice.